let me talk about a methodological principle, which I think is actually absolutely crucial, essentially to all of my major philosophical positions. And I'm honestly not sure what is the best name for this principle, but let me call it Fallibilism. I have heard it referred to as Fallibilism, notably by Roderick, if that's a reference that means anything to you. But I've also seen different people mean something else by Fallibilism. So let me explain. The way I would define Fallibilism in simplest possible terms, following Roderick, would be to say that Fallibilism is a belief about your beliefs that they may turn out to be wrong. So in this sense, Fallibilism expresses a certain commitment to a kind of skepticism, a certain open-mindedness, openness to experience, openness to having your positions changed through argument or through evidence. Also, in a deeper sense, an ontological and even a theological acknowledgement of the fundamental limitation of the capacity of the human mind, a negative claim that we make from within the limitations of our intellect, an observation that apparently, that as best we can tell, as far as we can tell, the human intellect is incapable of grasping truth with a capital T, an introspective observation that the feeling of guide is a horrible indication of correctness or truthfulness. That is to say that it's perfectly possible to be completely convinced of one's correctness, to feel the certainty of one's belief, and then, sometimes shockingly, to be alerted to the obviousness of one's mistake. Now, properly speaking, everything I said, of course, would require a long examination and substantiation, a detailed and hopefully systematic discussion of the nuances of skeptical epistemology. And I do try to engage in this kind of a systematic discussion elsewhere on my channel in the different videos that I make. And of course, there are plenty of authoritative resources available on this topic. So by all means, colleagues, I invite you to explore all of these fascinating topics at your own leisure. But let me also make a very important further point here. And when I talk about fallibilism these days, I always invariably keep this further complication in mind. And that is, together with my commitment to skepticism, I also share a commitment to dialogue, or collegiality if you want. Again, properly speaking, this point requires careful justification. However, for the sake of the argument here, let me just say that following Sextus Empiricus, in exactly the same way in which I acquiesce before the appearance of limitation of my mind, in the same way I acquiesce and therefore passively assent to the apparent social nature of my intellect. As I like to quote Raymond Geuss's restatement of Herder's position, individual consciousness is linguistic, and language is social, and society is historical. Therefore, individuality, individual thought, is linguistic, and therefore social, and therefore historical. We always already find ourselves, yes, trapped in a consciousness which reveals its own limitation. And we also always already find ourselves trapped in a consciousness which operates through categories which are essentially social. We think in linguistic terms. Inside of our own head, we speak in a language which is not of our own invention, language that we have been taught by others, as a matter of biographical fact. And so perhaps I should call my personal strain of fallibilism something like dialogical fallibilism. And let me clarify this dialogical fallibilist position with an example. By trade, I am a teacher of philosophy. But I take my pedagogical ethics with utmost seriousness, and I try to apply them to all the spheres of my life. And so the way I see myself as a private individual, let's say as a member of a family, but also as a member of a profession, of the profession of teachers of philosophy, and even more broadly, as a citizen of a country, and perhaps even as a member of the community of the entire humanity. In all of these capacities, as a private individual, as a teacher, as a citizen, and as a human being, I feel that my dialogical fallibilism compels me to speak with a certain tone, to speak in a certain manner. That is to say, to never prophesize, to never make special claims to particular truthfulness of the words that I am saying, but to only put forward any statement as a kind of a hypothesis, a tentative hypothesis, remembering my skeptical epistemology, but also a hypothesis which is pronounced as a line in a dialogue. It is a hypothesis which I put forward as a member of a discussion, only claiming to be no more than a voice in the discussion, attempting to persuade, hopefully using nothing but the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, the Habermasian zwanglosen Zwang des besseren Arguments. And of course, never to persuade finally, but at best only to persuade to tentatively accept the hypothesis as a working hypothesis for the time being, keeping an open mind to the alternatives until perhaps a better argument comes around. To some, perhaps this might sound a bit too pretentious or too daunting, but that is my aspiration. Perhaps, ultimately, in any given situation, the ideal might prove too lofty. But even if the bar is too high, one may still aspire to approximate it, to approach it as best as one can. And let me just finish by saying that after 20 years of my experience of trying to engage with serious philosophy professionally, I think that something like this form of dialogical skepticism can be found in most of the major intellectual traditions in the history of the philosophy of humanity throughout the whole world. This is what appears to me to be the best, meaning at the same time the most correct and the most productive way to read the various philosophers as disparate as Laozi and Buddha, as Heraclitus or Plato, as Sextus Empiricus or Nagarjuna, as Hobbes or Hume, as Rousseau or John Stuart Mill, as Jean-Francois Lyotard or, of course, Michel Foucault. So, colleagues, in the spirit of dialogical fallibilism, let me invite you to treat my words seriously. And throughout the various videos and lectures that you can find by me, I am trying to present ideas which I find to be important, and I am trying my best to present them in the most accurate form possible. But at the end of the day, and this is why I always tell my students, you are not my students, you are my colleagues. I wouldn't want anybody to simply blindly follow what I say. I completely agree with John Stuart Mill that we cannot progress mentally or cognitively. In fact, we cannot even quite understand what is it that we believe. We cannot quite know the full meaning of our own statements unless we are actively trying to find the best arguments against them, the best argument on the other side. In fact, I think that when we engage in a serious study of history of philosophy, we come to the realization that not only individual words are limited and capture reality only very imperfectly, but even whole philosophical conceptions only at best represent a kind of angle, only one angle among many different angles, and the totality of what really exists always proves to be elusive. And yet we can somehow approximate reality by combining, by juggling different angles, different approaches, different ways of looking at the world. I think this is what Max Weber, for example, means when he talks about ideal types, one-sided accentuations, imperfect models, einseitige Steigerung in German, right? Where the reality, the real type, would be a combination of potentially infinite number of ideal types. And so what I think we're trying to do when we study the history of philosophy seriously is that, so to speak, we're trying to learn to emulate the ways of thinking of particular philosophers inside of our own head. That, to borrow an analogy from computing, it's like we're trying to construct a module within our own head, actually a system of modules. Let's say a module which would emulate the way of thinking of Plato or of Aristotle or of Rousseau or Laozi. So it's like we're trying to create something like a council within our own head. Incidentally, I think this is a very good way to describe what Hegel is trying to do in the phenomenology of spirit, which is why to this day I consider Hegel's phenomenology to be one of the most important books, like a very strong contender for the most important philosophical work ever written. A story for another time, perhaps, but let me go back. So I've been laying out this intricate picture. And this whole picture, this picture of what I called here dialogical fallibilism, is precisely what I have in mind when I say, colleagues, that I invite you into the dialogue. I invite you to participate in this collective activity, which is the philosophical dialogue. So on this happy note, colleagues, let me say thank you so very much for your company. I hope you can see how it follows from my discussion of dialogical fallibilism that this literally could not have been possible without you. So by all means, feel free to keep in touch. Any kind of feedback is always highly appreciated. And until next time, stay safe and take care.